For 13 years, my guest visited his mom in a nursing home. For the last 8 years of her life, she couldn't talk. So he found other conversations, and they became a book. We're going to talk to him in a few minutes. Stay tuned. You're listening to My Spouse Has Dementia, a podcast that uses personal stories, occasional interviews, and simple rituals to support dementia caregiving spouses, because approximately 40% of us die first. I'm Zita Christian, writer, widow. I'm also the host and producer of a show called Page One. It's a show for writers. You can find it on YouTube under Zita TV Network. One of my guests on the show was John Scully. I invited him because he had written a book called Visited Mom Today. So I took a good chunk of that interview, and I'm using it here on My Spouse Has Dementia. I think you'll find our conversation interesting. I'm sharing this interview with you because I also think that there might be more than a few of you in the audience who might at some point give some thought to writing a memoir about your experience as a caregiver. We aren't only entertained by stories, we learn from them, and sometimes we're comforted by them. And in this interview, John talks about the publishing process that he chose to bring his book into the world. I haven't met anyone yet from the publishing company John chose, so this is not a recommendation. Just FYI, I've also discovered a podcast called Alz Authors, ALZ Authors. On that podcast, they feature books written by family dementia caregivers. John Scully's book, Visited Mom Today, is really not about his mom. It's about conversations he had with other people in the memory care facility when he went to visit his mom. For those of you who are considering a memory dwelling for a loved one, you might find this interview and John's book particularly interesting. During this episode, you might hear a reference to Page One. Just know that's the original source for this interview. I am delighted to introduce to you my guest today for a lot of reasons, professional and personal. His name is John Scully, and he has written a phenomenal book. It's called Visited Mom Today. John, welcome. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Zita. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You know, the viewers of Page One, it's a show for writers, and it's a show about books. So people who are interested in reading and they're always looking for something new, something interesting, they're the audience I have. So I want to talk a little bit about the writing, but I find that more and more lately, there's a growing interest, and certainly I have a personal interest in books about caregiving, and especially when dementia is involved. So I'm personally and professionally glad that you're with me today.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Give me a little overview about the book, because I said in the little open that you found other conversations. What were they?
Well, what happened was, because my mother was nonverbal, I would take her to different places in the memory care unit, just so really the point was for her to be involved, that she didn't feel left out just because she wasn't able to speak. And I found these conversations with residents in a way that was just really organic and natural. I would sit down at a table, or I would sit in a couch, and somebody would either join us or I would be joining them. It really was something that I learned very early on, that I needed to step into their world because they could no longer step into mine. The conversations were with several different residents, mostly, obviously, people who wanted to talk to me. There certainly were people that didn't, and there certainly were people that weren't reachable at all. So these were people that were open and most times gregarious and just interesting to talk to.
Well, you mentioned just now, you said how important it was for you to, what was the phrase, be in their world.
Step into their world.
Yeah, because they weren't able to step into your world anymore. And I cared for my husband who died of Alzheimer's. I
Right.
understand that. But he was at home, and
Hmm.
I don't have the experience of what it would be like in a nursing home or some kind of a memory dwelling where
Hmm.
there are other residents. So were you able to see some kind of a commonality or a thread or something where the people you spoke with went to a certain time in their life, whatever the world was that they were in? Like, could you see it defined by a profession or by an age or by a relationship or something, some kind of commonality?
Right. Yeah, actually, it was all of those things, Zita. It was not
Oh.
anything in particular. There was one woman who was one of my very favorite people to talk to who was a nurse in her career. And she thought that she was working as a nurse in the memory care unit. So, she went to her career. There were other people that went to being a parent. And if I sat down and somebody said, "Oh, I can't talk to you for very long because I have to go get my kids at school," I would just say, "Well, what schools do they go to? Or how old are your kids? Or what are their names?" And just sort of stay in that world. I also, unfortunately, had a woman that I spoke to who had been in an abusive relationship. And when I saw her, she was dreading that this man was going to be coming to see her and that she was worried and upset. So I think it went to it just depended on the day, I would say, because people could be almost anywhere.
Well, tell me what you wouldn't say. I think that's equally important when you're having conversations with people who you are stepping into their world. What do you not say?
Well, an example in the book also is a woman who I came into the dining room and she was sitting by herself at a table and she was crying. I went over and sat next to her and I asked her, was she okay? Is everything all right? And she told me that she had just found out they had just told her that her husband had died, when in fact her husband had died many years before. So I said, is there anything I can do? And she wanted to know if I could call her daughter. So, because they needed to make the plans. So instead of saying to her, "Oh, your husband died so many years ago," or you don't need to make plans. He died, a long time ago. I just sort of stepped into it. And over time, distracted her with other things. And it was over for after a short time. But I don't know how many times that would come up for her, over and over again, but not to correct somebody, not to say, you're not, "Oh, your children are grown up. They're not in school," or "What are you talking about?" Or, things that will embarrass them because they know they've made a mistake, or things that frustrate them because it is their reality and it is real to them. And so anything that's said to either correct, and we're so conditioned to correcting people, correcting our children, correcting coworkers, but with a person with Alzheimer's, correcting them is only going to make them shut down because they don't want to be making a mistake or they don't want to feel frustrated. So saying anything other than trying to be in their world is probably the thing that people need to do most.
How did you learn how to do that?
Well, I watched when my mother first went in, I watched the staff and how they would either answer the same question over and over again, or somebody would say, "I want to call my husband," and, or "Is my husband still here?" And they'd say, "Oh, yes, he's, out in the other room. You'll see him later." Or you'll call him after dinner, just to kind of keep them on task. And I saw that they were, some people would say, "Oh, you're lying to them," but it isn't really lying. It's really sparing their feelings and really letting them just exist and live, rather than be correcting and make them shut down. So I learned by watching them. And then honestly, I just followed my instincts. Once I had one or two of these conversations and I saw, well, this really works. This can really make somebody spend time talking to you and interesting conversations a lot of times, most of the times. I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do to be able to make people talk.
Did you have any favorite conversations of the, well, let's get back a minute. How long are the conversations and how many are in the book?
Well, I have about 40 conversations in the book. And I went to visit my mother for 13 years, an average of 2.5 times a week. Some weeks 3, some weeks 2, and except for during the pandemic. And when I visited, I had these conversations all the time, but mostly the last 8 years when she was nonverbal. But most of the time, the conversations were pretty ordinary. They weren't anything specific, anything overly special. It was like having just regular conversation, but just in their world. The collection that I have in the book is 40 conversations that were what I considered the sweet, poignant, funny, warm conversations that were like little gifts that I was receiving that I thought I have to keep these. I have to remember these. And so I wrote them down.
Now, flipping here for a minute for those in the audience who are writers. For many, many years, I taught a class in writing fiction. And one of the techniques I taught people was how to keep track of names, because as writers, we have a tendency to favor certain initials. I noticed that, in the very beginning of your book, you mentioned that for the sake of the privacy of the patients whose stories you were telling, you had changed the names. And so I was immediately curious, how did you choose the names? Like, are they friends?
Some of them are friends. Some
Okay.
of them are people that were special during this whole process, either, friends or staff members. I also found that there were some names that were, if I used them, they were going to be too obvious, almost like a name like yours, Zita.
Yes.
Like, you know, if I had used a name like yours, people would have just thought of you. So I used names that also were pretty, you know, generic, that it could have been anybody. I was
Okay.
really careful about really protecting, privacy in every way that I could.
Sure.
But I loved picking the names. It was fun,
Yeah.
you know? It was
Yeah.
really enjoyable.
Well, now let me just stay with that for a minute. Let's say the family, the relatives of the people whose stories you're telling that you included in the book, do they know? Because obviously the characters in your book don't have the same names as their loved one. So
Right.
do they even know about it,
They
about the
don't.
book?
No. I mean, some have found out since the book was published, but since I didn't need releases or, and I and honestly, some may not even know the conversations because some of them were really, short conversations. Just some, especially the flippant ones, sort of like a little bit of a wisecrack. Those were just short and funny, and I don't think that they, would even have known unless I saw them to tell them. So I don't think they would identify them. They could identify the spirit in which it was delivered and maybe assume it was their relative because some of the feisty, funny people, boy, they're just feisty and funny in their whole life.
Well, that's one of the things that I did want to talk about, because one of the things I loved about the content, the tone of many of the stories, with exceptions of examples like the woman you were saying who had been in an abusive relationship and she had anxiety about this person returning. The other conversation, and that one's not in the book, but other conversations, I thought I took a lot of comfort in thinking that based on what you had included in the book, these people in these memory dwellings, they make friends. There, there's a, I don't know if happiness is the right word, but it wasn't sad. It wasn't, it wasn't, I think a lot of people when they make the decision that someone else needs to care for their loved one in a dwelling, because think about it, you go into a nursing home, there's at least 3 shifts of
Mhm.
people and they're working and you're trying to do this at home and you're doing all 3 shifts 24/7.
Right.
That's
Right.
burnout. I could never have kept my husband at home had it not been
Mhm.
for my family and my neighbors.
Right.
So
Yeah.
sometimes there's that feeling of regret or that feeling of guilt. And then, on the part of the family member who is, moving their loved one to a dwelling, But when you read these little vignettes in your book, it's like there was one where you came in straight from work one
Mm,
evening. You still had on a suit and tie from your job, and you came in, and there were a group of 4 or 5 ladies all sitting
mm.
together, and they misidentified you.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah,
what
they
was,
thought
tell
that,
me about that.
sure. I walked in, I was running late, and as I was walking in, they were having graham crackers and cranberry juice for their evening snack. And the room was crowded, it was a dining room. And as I was walking in, there was really kind of a lot of noise coming from this one table. And so as I got closer, the ringleader of the groups, leaned in and said, "Shh, shh, quiet, girls. Here comes the minister." I came in and I said, "Wow, sounds like everybody's having a good time." And they said, "Oh, yes, Reverend. Isn't the wedding beautiful?" And there they were. They, were at a wedding. And I said, "Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful wedding." And she held up her cranberry juice and she said, "And we're on our second glass of wine." And it was just, that was actually, Zita, it's interesting you should mention that story because that really was what started to change everything for me. Before that, I sort of had a little bit of the feeling, as you mentioned before, of, this is a nursing home. I'm so sad that my mother needs to be here, that this was a, a hard place to be. And I all of a sudden saw that there was a community of people who were together and laughing and talking and having fun. And it didn't matter whether they knew where they were or they thought they were at a wedding. They were together and having fun. And it changed everything. That's actually when I started to write down the conversations. That was the first one I wrote.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yes, it was the
You,
first one I wrote.
and to me, it speaks so much about the importance of conversation. Not that it has to be accurate at all. It doesn't have to be factual. And
Hmm.
I remember when my husband became nonverbal, and, well, he went back and forth a little towards the end. In fact, the times when he acted were a few times toward in those last couple of weeks where he came out with a full sentence, which was,
Wow.
I mean, I remember them. I
Oh,
recorded
wow.
them. One of them anyway. I just happened to have my phone with me, and the other one, I had it engraved on our headstone.
Oh, wow.
It was just a couple of days before he died. We were in the bathroom, and I was cleaning up after him and everything. And I say that because it was such an odd time and place.
Mm,
And out of nowhere, and he just
sure.
said to me, "I have a lot of love for you today."
Mm,
And geez, I shouldn't have done that.
wow. That's beautiful.
And that was the last like full sentence. It was the last clear kind of communication in words
Mm,
that he said before he died the following Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. And so I find that the power of conversation itself is valuable in so many ways. Obviously, the person who has dementia is trying to communicate and wants to know that somebody is receiving, getting the
right.
message. But for the person on the other end, for the caregiver, to
Absolutely.
know that, can still, oh, I didn't think this would happen today,
Mm,
that you can still connect with the person
absolutely.
you love and know that even if it's only momentary, that person that you love is in there.
Exactly.
And so that power of sound, of
Hmm.
the vibration of words, and even if the words make no sense, there's something about the tone,
Hmm.
and there's that exchange of what feels like conversation. And that's
Right.
comforting when you've been, married to somebody a long time, or you're caring for a parent, or, a
Hmm.
child or a sibling, someone you have a long relationship with. That power of
Right.
conversation is so important, which is also one of the reasons I just loved your book, because it showed so many times that conversation was able to express their joy or their eagerness to do something, or maybe a frustration with something. Because you had
Mhm.
mentioned somewhere, I don't remember, I don't think it was in a story, I think it might have been in an epilogue, but you had mentioned that there were some people who you weren't really excited about, you weren't eager to talk
Hmm.
with some of those people. And I thought, okay, why? Were they like curmudgeons or hard to get to have conversation? I mean, what was that reason? What was the story behind that?
Yeah. The ones that I didn't really approach were the ones that were either, angry, or people who, because there are people that, their personality turns angry. And there were some people like that. There were also people that are like wanderers, that just want to keep moving. And so to sit down and have a conversation is almost impossible. So those were the reasons that I would sort of wait. But what you said before, though, Zita, about the connection, that's the connection. Because I think when somebody is sort of discounted as they don't have anything to offer and they're ignored, then they're not going to, they're not going to live. They're not going to engage. But somebody who knows that they're being heard, or they're somebody who knows they're connecting with somebody, is going to be so open and so who they are now, and not who they were before, but they're going to be who they are in that moment. And that's really beautiful.
It is. And I just want to say, in case anybody is just joining the show now, my guest is John Scully, and he has written this lovely little book of a collection of these little vignettes of conversation in a memory care facility when he was, visiting his mom. And the book is called Visited Mom Today, which I think is the perfect title. And it becomes a theme. It's this overarching way of collecting all of the information in the story. I thought that was brilliant. Plus, it's easy to remember. So also then your website, visitedmomtoday.com, also makes that very easy to remember.
And the reason I really used that was because when I did these conversations, when I started sharing them on social media, I would start the social media post, Visited Mom Today. And then I would start to say what happened, so that I didn't just start it because people wouldn't know what the context was. So this Visited Mom started all of them, and this is what it turned into.
I think that was really smart. So I have two areas that I still want to talk with you about. And one is, because I'm switching gears now, and this is for
Sure.
the writers in the audience. We live in a world today where there are so many avenues to publishing. I mean, years ago it was, you got an agent, you submitted to a major publisher, and most everybody got rejected. That's just the way of the world. And then there was vanity press, and people would, take out a second mortgage and, go into debt for, so many of those arrangements were scams. And then comes this hybrid. There's this independent publishing and all these hybrid opportunities. There's so many ways now for people to get published that are legitimate, that come with editorial services and somebody to help you with a cover or editing or just so many things. So the route that you took, I think, if I got this right, you went to Greenheart Living Press. Tell me about that. How did you find out about it? What
Sure.
made you decide?
Well, interesting that I thought the only way you could do it was the first way you said, Zita, and that was to send it to a big publisher and get rejected. So I had no interest in doing that. It seemed like a lot of work to get rejected. That was my perception. I had people telling me that I should put these in a collection. So I happened to last November be on a panel with a woman named Lisa Marshall, who wrote a book, Oh, Hello, Alzheimer's.
I love that book. Oh.
Yeah, right? So she and I were on this panel for caregivers. And I heard her introduced. I had heard of her. I'd seen her actually on CBS on Steve Hartman. And I heard her introduced, and she said that she had just written a book or had released a book. And I thought, this is the universe. The universe is telling me I should find out about this. So I asked if I could meet with her. And we met, and she told me, it's not as hard as you think, but it's not what you're thinking, because I told her what my perception was of it. And she told me what she did. And she gave me two contacts. And one of them was Greenheart Living Press, who also did her book, released or published her book. And so I went to them based on that. And she liked the idea, and we went with it.
So tell me a little bit, though, about the experience, because I say there's
Okay.
a lot of people who watch the show who are writers. And I know that because they've written to me. I had some people who would meet regularly in Barnes and Noble, and I was in there one day and they said, "Oh, I recognize you. You have that show about writing. And, we watch your show and then we talk about it." And I thought, well, it was very flattering. It truly was. And I felt this responsibility.
Mhm.
Let's say I need to share some real information. So, like,
Yeah, the process, Sita. I had no interest in writing a book. It wasn't something that I ever thought that I would want to do or could do. And so I kind of sheepishly went to Greenheart Living Press with an idea. And she came back to me and said that she loved the idea, and we started to talk. And actually we agreed on the fact that she had different packages for what people would need. Some people
right.
might need coaching. Some people might need help with their writing. Some people might need help with a number of things that I had already written a lot of these, and she would edit them, but I didn't need, the help with the writing so much. But then she wanted it to look professional, as I did. So, we need to do a foreword. We need to do an afterword. We need to do, what kind of paper do you want to use? What do you want
Yes.
your cover to look like? Who do you want to do the cover? Like so many decisions that if I had done this on my own, I would have been overwhelmed. And they just narrowed it down to these things that I would need and helped me through the process. And it was really I worked hard, but it was a very structured process that got us right to where we wanted to be for the deadline.
So what was the time frame, though, from the time that
Okay.
you have that first meeting with the editor, and then comes the point where, okay, here, now you have a book. Like, are we
So,
talking a couple years, which is what it
no.
is in traditional publishing?
Well, I think because I had so many of the vignettes already done, so much of the writing done, that I signed a contract in February and it was released in August.
Oh my gosh.
Really, it was more
Wonderful.
about the mechanics and editing because the writing was really done. So that saved a whole bunch of time.
Okay, that's really good to know. And I have one last thing to ask you about, because I know we're running short on time. This always goes by
Sure.
so fast. I want to know about your work as a death doula, or as some
Yeah.
call an end of life doula. I'm very
Okay.
familiar with that. I do a lot of rituals. I do weddings, but I do funerals and memorials. I'm not a
Mhm.
death doula, though. How does that work? How did that influence your whole experience in gathering these stories?
Well, I think that I worked in marketing for 38 years. And my mother, these two things, the death doula and the book, only happened because of the experience with my mother. If she had not had Alzheimer's, I am sure that neither of those things would have happened. So, isn't life
Well,
interesting?
isn't it though? Well, that's my interview with John Scully, author of the book Visited Mom Today. If you've listened to the previous episode of this podcast, the one where I talk about how influential Walter Cronkite was on me when I was growing up, then you know I think it's important that we get information from various sources. And that's one of the main reasons I wanted you to hear my interview with John Scully. If you know someone who is caring for a spouse with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia, please tell that person about this podcast. If you or that person would like to leave a voicemail for me, and I hope you do, please go to the website myspouseHasDementia.com. On the right-hand side, you'll see a little vertical purple bar with an icon for a microphone. Just press the bar, and you will have 2 minutes to leave a message. If you'd prefer to write, and that's fine too, send an email. You can write to Zita, that's Z as in zebra, Zita, Zita at myspouseHasDementia.com. I don't have an assistant. No one sees my email but me. And in the meantime, when I say take good care of yourself, those words aren't fluffy, they're fierce, because we need to survive. Thank you for listening all the way to the end.